And I'd come home at night, and the last thing I want to hear is some kids singing my song badly under my window when I'm trying to sleep, because I had to get up early the next day and make this show. And they used to do it. They did it for a couple of days, and I used to chase them with the intent to murder.
Radio personality Bobby J sings with the modern version of the Teenagers.
The story of the teenagers singing under Richard's window is a little embellished, and I think if there was any under-the-window encounter, it was because they were pestering him to take them downtown to George Goldner and G Records, where he was not only recording, he was George's A&R man.
Barrett finally agreed to set up an audition for the Teenagers at G Records. Frankie was still just the squirt who sang background, but again, luck was on his side.
The famous story goes,
legend has it,
Herman Santiago came down with the flu.
and George Goldner,
He says, let the little kid try. Let me hear. Frankie sang the song.
And that's how we came about. I think he had a stronger voice, and it didn't matter who sang it as long as it happened.
Frankie sang a tune he and the guys wrote called Why Do Birds Sing So Gay? Goldner signed them on the spot and released their song with the more masculine title, Why Do Fools Fall in Love?
You knew, listening to it, it was going to be a smash, and the rest of it was history.
The song, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, hit the charts and rose so quickly. Everybody had this monumental thing that they didn't know what to do with, and so they threw them out there quickly, and it changed their lives. It changed their lives.
And not necessarily for the better. Coming up, the Teenagers go from media darlings to musical dropouts, and Frankie Lymon flirts with the dark side of fame. In 1955, Frankie Lymon was just a 13-year-old pipsqueak from Harlem who wanted to sing with the big boys. But by January of 1956, the song Why Do Fools Fall in Love was burning up the charts. And suddenly, Frankie Lymon was the voice behind a rock and roll revolution.
Frankie was the most energetic, charming, charismatic, tiny person on the planet at the time.
I was 11 when that record came out, and it was the first time I really felt like this is ours, you know, my generation.
Ronnie Spector, pioneering lead singer of the Ronettes, grew up in Harlem and knew Lymon.
I was in love with Frankie. I was in love with Frankie from the time I was 12 years old, and when I heard Why Do Fools Fall in Love on the radio, I didn't know if he was black, white. All I knew was he had the greatest voice I'd ever heard.
It was the maturity in how he sang his words, how he approached a singer. He sang like a grown-up.
The precocious 13-year-old also behaved like a grown-up, and why not? For most of 1956, Frankie and the Teenagers toured with performers who were often twice their age.
We were hungry for girls, as all boys are. We saw how adult singers were womanizers, and so we copied that. Those guys were our role models.
Singer Jimmy Castor often traveled with Frankie in the group and sings lead with the modern version of the Teenagers.
Frankie would be with women at 14 and 15 years old, you know, women who were, 25 and older. And he could handle that.
But women weren't the only vices the tiny teen idol discovered on the road.
There was alcohol, and occasionally we might see someone smoking marijuana. I experimented with drinking naturally. I think that we all did a little bit, But remember, we were still 17 years old. Frankie was 13.
They were introduced to all of these things, and Frankie was introduced, and of course he was a tough guy, and he felt that he could do whatever he wanted when and he got hooked.
It wasn't long before the street-smart young heartthrob began flirting with heroin, and there was even more trouble ahead. Remember, 1957 was still the early days of rock and roll, and the business was run by some pretty tough customers. One of those tough guys was reputed mob associate Morris Levy. In '57, Levy took over the small label where Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers recorded. He also began managing the group.
Morris Levy, he was part of the evil element. He was responsible for us being ripped off for the money that the music that we created earned.
It is my understanding that Morris was probably the catalyst to separate the Teenagers from Frankie Lymon to create two acts, of course, looking upon Frankie as the super attraction.
Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers released a half-dozen hits in a little more than a year. But by the time the group finished their triumphant European tour in May of '57, new manager Morris Levy had convinced 14-year-old Frankie that he'd be better off flying solo.
Frankie was all for the idea of a record being released with just him by himself on one side, and we had a confrontation about that. And Frankie ran out of the hotel room. And when he returned, when we did see him again, it was, I'm leaving the group. I'm out of here.
And just like that, after a year and a half of unprecedented success, the kid who once begged to sing background was now standing alone in the spotlight.
18 months seems to be a magic number in rock and roll. Between the time Little Richard had Tutti Frutti and the time he got religion, 18 months. Buddy Holly, between the time That'll Be the Day hit and the time the plane went down, 18 months. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, legend, 18 months. Isn't that amazing?
Devastating is more like it. The bitter breakup cost the Teenagers their career, but it will cost Frankie Lymon even more. Up next, the death of a child star. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers went from harmonizing on Harlem street corners to being the most influential teen group in the world. In 1957, they released their 8th and final single, Out in the Cold Again. It was a fitting title because after a red-hot 18 months, that's exactly where the Teenagers were. But luck was also running out for Frankie Lymon. 1957's Frankie Lymon at the London Palladium was the former Teenagers' first solo effort. Unfortunately, it was filled with pop standards that went nowhere. Even worse, Frankie's voice was changing. And by age 17, Lyman's signature boy soprano was history. But Frankie had an even bigger problem.
Frankie was introduced to heroin rather early on in his stardom. That kind of addiction is a progressive thing. It only gets worse.
As Frankie suffered the failure of his second solo album in 1958, his drug habit grew.
This was somebody who wanted to maintain the success that he had had as a 13 and 14-year-old. And now he's 17, and he's away from his group. He's pretty much out on his own with people who are not in his corner manipulating his career.
By that time, drugs was what he was living for. And the only one that could help Frankie was Frankie.
But Frankie seemed helpless in the face of his addiction. He still managed to hustle appearances here and there, but by age 20, any chance of reviving his glory days was long gone.
He just didn't have the voice. They would have to change the key maybe 5 notes down, and it would sound horrible. So when Frankie did things on TV, he would always lip sync towards the end.
Lyman's performance on the Hollywood A Go-Go television show in 1965 revealed just how far Frankie had fallen.
He was missing a tooth, his skin was in bad shape, and he was forced to have to lip sync. It was sad for most of his fans to witness.
Soon, Frankie was selling everything he could to finance his habit. Former manager Morris Levy gladly grabbed Frankie's publishing rights to Why Do Fools Fall in Love for a measly $1,500. And then when Frankie's money ran out, the fallen star resorted to petty theft. In 1966, Lymon landed in front of a judge who made the 24-year-old former phenom an offer he couldn't refuse.
He was given a choice to get off the streets, or we're going to, put another kind of uniform on you.
While he was in the Army, he was stationed in Augusta, Georgia, and he met a woman there who was a school teacher who he felt could help to turn his life around. And that woman was Amira Eagle, who became his wife.
Frankie and Amira tied the knot on June 30th, 1967. And for a while, it looked like marriage in the military had the former child star singing a new tune.
When I met Frankie, there was no sign of drug use when he was with me. We discussed this, and I told him that I would not put up with it.
But being on stage was one drug Frankie couldn't give up.
He entertained around here in nightclubs part-time. Whenever he would go out to sing, people asked him to do, "Hey, Frankie, what about doing Why Do Fools Fall in Love?" He tried, but he could no longer do that. So it was kind of frustrating to him also at that point.
By February of 1968, after only 8 months of marriage, 26-year-old Lymon was itching for one more shot at the big time.
Frankie went to New York because his manager called him. He had a weekend job. So he did not want to go by himself. He didn't want to leave me.
Maybe the singer knew what was waiting for him. Lymon was drawn back to New York by his obsession to perform, but in the end, his other obsession took over.
I think that Frankie was about to go into the studio to record a new song, and I think the night before, he was in his grandmother's apartment, and he shot up, and he died in the bathroom on the floor.
I often wonder if he had not elected to try to come back to New York and try to re-energize his career, if somehow he would still be with us.
I've often said over the years that if Frankie were still with us today, he would have been our generation's Sammy Davis Jr. He would have been the darling of the Vegas Strip because he had that kind of talent.
I think he would be like Nat King Cole. Frankie would be as great as Frank Sinatra had he lived.
Frankie's demise wasn't the end to this sad song. Why Do Fools Fall in Love made Lymon's name worth millions after his death. Up next, Frankie's widow tries to collect and finds out the hard way about her late husband's love life. Frankie Lymon was 26 when he died flat broke on a bathroom floor in 1968. By 1981, 2 of the other 4 members of Lymon's group, the Teenagers, were also dead. But there was one thing that never missed a beat: the song, Why Do Fools Fall in Love?
Why do fools fall in love? So the song came back around and was used in a Hallmark greeting card commercial. Then it was used in American Graffiti. But it wasn't until Diana Ross re-recorded Why Do Fools Fall in Love in 1981 that all of a sudden people suddenly said, where's all that money going?
Not to Frankie's widow, Amira, that's for sure. Frankie's former manager, Morris Levy, controlled the song. But although Frankie sold off his publishing rights to Why Do Fools Fall in Love, Lymon was still listed as the song's co-writer, which entitled him to royalties.
We went to Mr. Levy and asked him for the royalty, and this is when the battle started. He said, no, I'm not going to give it to you. We decided we were going to court.
But Levy had a notorious reputation for playing hardball, and he came up with a surprise for the would-be widow.
And then this is whenever he said, oh, I'm sorry, but you are not the legal wife. Frankie had 2 other women, 2 other wives. So, and then therefore, that they came on the scene.
Levy found 2 other women who Frankie had apparently married and never divorced before he met Amira. One of Frankie's wives was Zola Taylor, a former singer with the Platters. Actress Vivica A. Fox portrayed Frankie's other wife, Elizabeth Waters, in the 1998 film Why Do Fools Fall in Love.
I think Frankie was messy. He was. He was a mess. He was young, you know, but that was his way. If things got kind of rocky, he thought that was his way of holding the couple together, his way of making her feel good, like, baby, you know I love you. I love you, girl. I'm going to make you my wife. But he forgot to get divorced a couple of times.
Why do fools fall in love? In this case, for the money. Instead of paying Amira Lymon millions in back royalties, Levy allegedly struck a deal with Waters and Taylor, agreeing to pay a paltry $20,000 to the woman who could prove that she, in fact, was Lymon's legal wife. The infamous 3 Widows trial began in 1986 and dragged on for 2 years. Eventually, Lymon's marriage to Zola Taylor was deemed a hoax, and Zola's claim was thrown out. That left Elizabeth and Amira. Chuck Rubin of the Artists' Rights Enforcement Corporation assisted Amira Lymon with her case.
Eventually, a ruling came down that Miss Waters did actually have a common law relationship with Frankie in Philadelphia, and therefore she was a winner. But the Court of Appeals didn't look at it that way, and it was like 3-zip in favor of Amira.
But this game of musical chairs wasn't over. Remember, the song Why Do Fools Fall in Love started out as a doo-wop ditty that was written by all the teenagers before they were even discovered. Though years of double dealing left their names off the writing credits, the 2 surviving teenagers wanted a piece of the action.
They said they felt that they were entitled to their share of the song, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? Said because Frankie did not write all the song by himself. Said it was not his, it was the group.
We went to court. We had the jury right there, the 12 jurors, and we won the case straight up.
They went to the appellate court and appealed our federal court win. Our win was reversed a couple of years later. When
the dust finally settled, Amira netted $1.5 million from Frankie's royalties. The Teenagers didn't get credit or cash for writing Why Do Fools Fall in Love, but their contribution to music was acknowledged in 1993 when Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Getting into the Hall of Fame is a great feeling. I'm glad that it's finally here. I feel very good about it.
And original Teenagers, Merchant and Santiago, continue to perform with friends Jimmy Castor and Bobby J as an updated version of the Teenagers. But all agree that there will never be another Frankie Lymon.
Frankie was such a superstar. I mean, he was the natural-born star.
If you took him out of the 50s and put him into the 90s, he would blow everybody away.
There were so many entertainers we have today that say, hey, I learned so much from Frankie Lymon.
When there was a question about Frankie getting a star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame, people had to write in. The greatest of people wrote in. Johnny Mathis, Robert Guillaume, Louis Bellson, Madonna, Billy Joel. So what he contributed, he's still contributing.
Frankie Lymon may have lived fast and died young, but no one can deny that he and the Teenagers left a lasting mark on rock and roll. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me the next time we take a stroll down the flip side of the Walk of Fame.